His name was Giuseppe Iantosca. He was 10 years old. Every morning before school, he cut through the waterfront near Copp's Hill. Not because it was the fastest way, but because it was his way. The way that felt like his own small piece of a city that mostly ignored him. His father worked the docks. His mother baked bread before sunrise. Giuseppe carried a tin lunch pail to school. Cold on the outside, warm on the inside. Just like most things in his neighborhood. That morning, January 15th, 1919, he crossed the street the same way he always did, without looking up, without slowing down. The way you do something 1,000 times before you realize it could be the last. He never made it to school. And what stopped him wasn't a bullet, or a flood, or a fire. It was sweetness. Boston, 1919. The city smelled like salt water, coal smoke, and cold air. Horse hooves on cobblestones, steam rising from manholes. Workers moving before the sun fully showed itself. Nothing unusual. That's the strange part. It didn't feel like a city standing on the edge of disaster. It felt normal. Almost too normal. Near the North End waterfront, men were already at their jobs. Same routines. Same noise. Same tired rhythm of a city that never really stopped. This was an immigrant neighborhood. Italians mostly. Families packed into narrow tenements. Laundry lines strung between windows, children shouting in 2 languages at once. The people here knew hardship. They knew the smell of labor. They knew what it meant to live close to industry, close to danger, close to the edge. But they didn't know what they were living next to. Not really. It stood on Commercial Street like it had always been there. 90 feet wide. 50 feet tall, 2.5 million gallons of dark, thick molasses pressing against steel walls from the inside. The Purity Distilling Company had built it in 1915. Built it fast, built it cheap, built it in a hurry because the war in Europe was changing what money could buy. Molasses meant alcohol. Alcohol meant industrial fuel. Industrial fuel meant contracts. Contracts meant profit. So the tank went up. Not with the care you'd give something holding that much weight, but with the urgency of men who believed speed was the same as progress. Workers on the site noticed the problems early. Not dramatic ones. Not the kind that make you stop and call your foreman. Just dark syrup slowly seeping through the seams. A slow weep of molasses down the outer steel. They wiped it away, filled small gaps, stepped around the puddles. The neighborhood children came with cups. They scooped up the sweet residue dripping from the tank's lower seams. A free treat on the way home from school. Nobody stopped them. Because nobody imagined that what those children were touching was a sign. Inside the tank, the pressure was growing. A shipment of warm molasses had arrived from Cuba just days before. Warm liquid expands. Warm liquid pushes. The temperature that January had been swinging wildly. Cold nights, warmer days. The kind of weather that makes metal work harder than it should. Some men said later they heard sounds, low, irregular. A deep metallic groan late in the afternoon. Like a door shifting in an empty house. Like something settling under too much weight. But buildings make sounds. Factories make sounds. Industry is never quiet. so no one treated it as unusual. Arthur Gell was the company supervisor responsible for the tank. He had never worked in engineering, never studied structural design, but he signed the inspection documents anyway, year after year. No one asked him to prove what he knew. No one asked him to prove the tank could hold what it held. He was trusted because he held a title, and titles in 1919 were enough. At 12:40 in the afternoon, a sound moved through the north end that no one had ever heard before. Not an explosion, not a boom, something different. A crack, deep and structural, like something fundamental giving way. Then a sound like a cannon shot, then another. Then silence. For 1 second, the world held still. The tank didn't burst outward in a dramatic explosion. It simply opened. The steel wall buckled inward first. Then the rivets snapped, one after another, like buttons popping from a coat under too much strain. Then the plates separated, and the molasses came out. Not like water, not like a wave. Thicker, heavier, a living wall of brown moving faster than anyone expected. 25 feet high, traveling at 35 miles per hour. The first wave hit Commercial Street with the force of a collapsing building. Wooden structures splintered immediately. Telephone poles snapped like twigs. A section of the elevated railway was torn from its supports. A fire station on the street was lifted partially off its foundation. Firefighter George Lay was inside when the wave hit. He had been eating lunch. He didn't have time to stand up. The molasses took him through the wall and into the street. They found him hours later. He was one of the 21 who didn't survive. Giuseppe Iantosca was crossing the street when the wave hit. He was knocked off his feet immediately. The molasses surrounded him. He couldn't stand. He couldn't run. Every movement he made to free himself pushed him deeper. That was the horror no one anticipated. Water you can swim in, fire you can run from, but molasses holds you. It grips your legs, your arms, your lungs. It fills the space around you and refuses to let go. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. Giuseppe was lucky. A rescuer reached him within minutes, pulled him free, carried him away from the brown tide. He lived. But the lunch pail his mother had packed that morning, it vanished into the molasses without a trace, gone like it had never existed. He would talk about that lunch pail for the rest of his life. Not the fear, not the cold, not the sound. The lunch pail. Because some details stick to you the way molasses sticks to everything. The street fell silent in a way that felt wrong. No traffic, no footsteps, no ordinary city noise. Just distant voices calling names, and the sound of something thick, still, shifting slowly. Firefighters arrived first. They stepped carefully into the brown mass, each movement deliberate, like walking through wet cement. Ropes were thrown, hands reached out, voices called names into the stillness. But the distance felt longer than it was. 10 feet became impossible. Every rescuer who stepped forward risked becoming another victim. One firefighter fell to a knee. 2 others pulled him up. Slowly. Everything took time. And time was the enemy. Because the molasses was cooling. In the January air, it was thickening, tightening around the people still trapped inside. Every minute made rescue harder. Every minute meant less air. Every minute meant the sweet brown mass was becoming more like solid ground. A man named Peter Francis pressed himself against a building. He could feel the molasses climbing up his legs. He couldn't push it away. He could only wait and hope and breathe the air above it while it slowly, patiently tried to claim him. He survived, but the factory worker beside him did not. The smell spread across the city within hours. Sweet, warm, deeply out of place. It drifted through windows, clung to wool coats, followed people home on the soles of their boots. Horses refused to enter certain streets. They could smell something the humans were still trying to understand. Workers arrived with fire hoses. Water was sprayed across the cobblestones. Brown rivers ran toward the harbor. But molasses is not water. It doesn't wash away easily. It thins, darkens, and hides in the spaces between stones. Every surface resisted cleaning. Walls stayed sticky. Doorways held the residue for weeks. Boots tracked it through streetcars, through shops, through homes. The city had tried to wash itself clean. It took weeks, then months. Some people said they could still smell it in the summer, when the sun warmed the bricks, when the air stopped moving. Sweetness returning, like the city remembering something it would rather forget. 21 people died. Giuseppe's neighbor, a woman named Maria D'Estasio, was 40 years old when the wave took her. She had been standing in her doorway. She never knew what hit her. A teamster named William White died with his horses. They had been standing at the curb on Commercial Street, waiting on a delivery. Neither the man nor the animals had time to move. A 10-year-old girl named Pasquale Iantosca, no relation to Giuseppe, was also caught in the wave. She survived, but she never spoke about it to outsiders. Not once, in 70 more years of life. Some stories survive in silence. 150 people were injured. Many never fully recovered. Some carried molasses-related injuries for decades, joints that never worked right, lungs that never breathed easily again. And the neighborhood? The North End Italian community? They already lived under suspicion. In 1919, the word anarchist was enough to destroy a reputation. When the Purity Distilling Company suggested, almost immediately, that the explosion was caused by saboteurs, by anarchist bombers, many people believed it. It was easier to believe. Easier than admitting that the company had cut corners. Easier than admitting that no one had properly inspected the tank. Easier than asking who had signed the papers. The accusation pointed at an entire neighborhood, at people who could not easily defend themselves, at immigrants who already carried the weight of distrust. It was a lie. But lies told loudly enough have their own gravity. The lawsuit that followed was unlike anything Boston had seen. More than 100 plaintiffs, 6 years of testimony, more than 40,000 pages of evidence. Engineers were called in to examine what remained of the tank. They measured the steel plates, counted the missing rivets, compared what had been built against what had been promised. What they found was damning. The steel was thinner than it should have been. The design had never been properly reviewed. When the company had tested the tank before use, they had filled it with water, and water is lighter than molasses. The test had been meaningless, deliberately meaningless, or carelessly meaningless, which in the end is often the same thing. One engineer testified quietly that he had been in the business for 30 years. He had never seen a structure this size built with so little documentation. The company's lawyers kept returning to the sabotage theory. Anarchists, immigrants, unknown enemies. But the evidence was stubborn. No explosive residue, no evidence of tampering, no credible witnesses. Just a tank built by men in a hurry, signed by a man who didn't understand what he was signing, filled beyond what the steel could hold, in weather that made metal fail. Not one mistake, many small ones, stacked quietly on top of each other. For 4 years. In 1925, the judge ruled against the Purity Distilling Company. The court found that the disaster had been caused by negligence, not sabotage, not bad luck, not an act of God. Human failure, institutional failure, the kind of failure that happens when profit moves faster than caution. The company paid settlements. No one went to prison. That's the part that stays with you. The worker who had been eating lunch when the wave hit, the one who survived, walked past the corner years later. The tank was gone. The street had been repaved. New buildings stood where the molasses had reached. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. He slowed down anyway. Not because anyone asked him to, not because there was anything to see, but because the body remembers things the mind tries to let go of. His hands went slightly cold. His steps shortened. His breathing changed for a moment. Then he kept walking. Because what else do you do? Cities don't stop for their disasters. They absorb them. They build over them. They rename the streets and repave the cobblestones and keep moving. But something invisible stayed behind in the north end. The people who lived through January 15th, 1919, walked a little differently near that corner for the rest of their lives. Not afraid, just aware. Aware that the world can be ordinary and catastrophic at the same moment. Aware that the things that serve a city can also destroy it. Aware that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it leaks, slowly, quietly, for years. Until one afternoon in January, it decides it has waited long enough. The disaster changed things in ways that took years to see. Cities began requiring engineering inspections with real teeth. Professionals had to sign their names to structures, and mean it. The idea that someone could oversee a 2.5 million gallon tank without engineering credentials began to seem absurd. Because it was. It had always been absurd. It just took 21 deaths to make that absurdity visible. And that might be the saddest part of all. Not the wave, not the loss, not even the cover-up. But the fact that the warnings were there. They had always been there. The leaking seams, the dark stains painted over to hide what was showing through, the groaning noises no one quite understood, the inspector who signed without knowing. Every warning was a question no one asked. Giuseppe Iantosca grew up. He got a job, he got married, he had children, and his children had children. He lived a full life in the same neighborhood where the molasses took everything it could reach on that January afternoon. When he was very old, a journalist came to ask him about the disaster, about the fear, about the escape, about what it felt like to be standing in the middle of something impossible. He thought about it for a long time before he answered. Then he said, "I remember the sweet smell. Even now, when I smell something sweet, sometimes I stop walking for a second." The journalist wrote it down. Then Giuseppe said something else. The people who built that tank, they didn't think about us. They didn't think we were the kind of people worth thinking about. He said it without anger, just as a fact. The kind of fact you've had a whole lifetime to make peace with. The journalist closed his notebook. He didn't have a follow-up question. Because there isn't one. Boston kept growing after 1919. Steel rose higher. Tanks grew larger. Industry moved faster. But something had shifted, quietly, impermanently, in the way that lessons shift when they're learned through grief rather than foresight. People began asking questions. Who checked this? Who signed that? What happens if it fails? Not always, not enough, but more than before. And sometimes, walking through a city, any city, it's worth remembering that underneath the ordinary surface of things, behind the walls and the routines and the familiar rhythms, there are always structures holding things together. Structures built by people, maintained by people, trusted by people. And sometimes those people cut corners, not out of cruelty, just out of habit, out of speed, out of the slow erosion of caution that happens when nothing has gone wrong yet. The sweetness of January 15th, 1919 didn't come from nowhere. It came from choices, small ones, made quietly over years, by people who never imagined standing in a courtroom answering for them. And it came for a 10-year-old boy crossing a street with a lunch pail, who had no idea, who never had any idea, because that's how these things happen. Not with a warning, not with a countdown. Just an ordinary morning, in a city that didn't know it was already inside history. The great Boston Molasses flood of January 15th, 1919 remains one of the strangest industrial disasters in American history. 21 people died. 150 were injured. The legal case that followed lasted 6 years and became a landmark moment in American industrial accountability. Giuseppe Iantosca was a real victim, a child caught in the flood who survived. The North End neighborhood where the disaster occurred is still home to one of Boston's oldest Italian-American communities. Some residents claimed, for decades, that on hot summer days the faint smell of molasses could still be found rising from the streets.